All right, thanks for having me today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here is this session we're talking about, cow efficiency and adaptability. Take a look at this picture for a moment, and we'll circle back to it at the end. But I think there's probably some important notes here. One of the other notes that I'll make, and part of the reason I phrased my title the way it is this idea of cow efficiency and adaptability is really multi-pronged, complicated. So this is really just one small piece of that much more larger and much complicated puzzle. So I was extremely fortunate in 2016, got a large grant from the USDA to look at local adaptation and to try to create some tools to create cattle that were matched to their environment. So want to acknowledge that USDA funding. And obviously, a lot of times when we think about environmental stress in beef cattle, perhaps our first thought is to think about heat stress. But really, cattle deal with all different types of stress, whether it be cold climates, wet climates, dry climates, etc. So it's not just heat stress. So this idea, this concept of looking at hair shedding to tell about the environmental adaptability, the ability to deal with heat stress in cattle is not something new. In fact, it's already part of the BIF wiki. There's a hair shedding page there. There's publications from the 1960s on this, and we really were inspired by work done by Cassidy and others, published in 2011. For the producers or those with extension appointments in the room, there's some nice resources. So we have a fact sheet, hair shedding scores, a tool to select heat-tolerant cattle. That's on the ebeef.org website. And then American Angus Association has also put out some hair shedding scoring guides. One of the things that I want to make sure to clarify at the start of this talk is there's a difference between hair coat and hair shedding, okay? And the way I like to think about this is hair coat is really talking about the differences between a very slick-haired Senegal cow and a very shaggy Highlander cow. So when I think about hair coat, that's what I think about. It's really a difference in how short and smooth the hair coat is. What we're talking about here is hair shedding. And so regardless of how long the hair coat is, how well does that cow do in turning over that winter hair into her summer hair? Okay, so we could produce a hair shedding score for a Highlander animal. I don't know what good that would do, but we could do that. But really what we're talking about is for our main production breeds in the U.S., how they're turning over that winter hair into a summer coat. Now, obviously, this is important. When I'm working on my farm out in July, there is no way in the world that I would wear my Carhartt coat. Right? I do not want to wear my coat in the summer, my winter coat in the summer. And so we need to identify those cows that are also well adapted enough to get rid of that winter coat. The hair shedding scoring system is quite simple. It's a 1 to 5 scale. A 1 is 100% shed off. A 5 is she still has 100% of her winter hair. That winter hair, of course, starts to look dead, dry, faded in color, etc. These cows, not as a rule of thumb, not always, but typically, shed from the top to the bottom and from the front to the back. Usually you'll see them scratching their neck on stuff, trying to get rid of that hair on the neck. That's usually the first place that we'll see them get rid of that winter hair is there on the neck. And typically it goes from the shoulder back and from the top line down. For me, what differentiates a score of a 1 from a 2 is a 2 will have a little bit of dead hair in front of that flank and a little bit of dead hair on that lower quarter. And then, you know, a 3 she's about 50% of the way shed off. We want to score these animals early enough that we see a lot of variation in the scores. So we want to pick a date for our location where we have a small percentage of cows scoring a 1, a small percentage of cows scoring a 5, and lots of 3s. So we want to score at a time in the spring, a time in the summer, where we have kind of a nice bell curve to the data. So as part of this USDA-funded project, we have hair scores on about 37,000 scores, and these represent 13,000 cattle. Most of these scores come between 2016 and 2020. A small number of this is older data from the University of Arkansas. About 2,000 of these animals were already genotyped by the cooperating producers to produce genomic enhanced EPDs, so we didn't genotype them a second time. So this data set has genotypes on about 11,500 animals. And those have all been imputed up to our set of 850,000 DNA markers. One of the things that we made sure to do in this project, and I think was a real success of the project, is we shared the data. So the producers would collect the DNA sample, they would collect the phenotype and the other metadata for us, they would send that to us. We would then send that DNA sample off to Neogen, they would genotype it. University of Missouri would obviously get a copy of that genotype data. But one of the other things we did is we sent a second copy of that genotype data to the breed association, so those cooperating producers got free genomic enhanced EPDs for their cattle who are cooperating in the project. And we have several different breeds represented in this data set. The lion's share, obviously, Angus. This is just how some of that data is distributed. So you can see that most of the scores were collected in 2016, 17, 18, and 19. We would have loved to have a lot more cows have 3 scores available in the data set, but most of the cows have 1 or 2 scores available in this data set. One of the things that I'll note is that this data set, because it is federally funded, will become publicly available when we publish the manuscript. So we're actively working on the manuscript right now. We'll probably submit it for publication in the next few weeks. It'll go through the peer review process. Then it'll be published. When it's published, the genotypes, phenotypes, and kind of some of the anonymized metadata will become publicly available for anyone and everyone to use, including DNA testing companies, other researchers, etc. The data is immediately available upon request to any of the participating breed associations that helped us recruit farms and ranches to participate in the project, gave the free genomic enhanced EPDs to their breeders. So already we have a research EPD is available. We described the development of that research EPD with the Angus Genetics Incorporated data in a publication led by Harley Durbin. So you can look that up online. And you can also look up on Angus Genetics Incorporated the research EPD, and I believe they have the EPDs released for any sires, I think, that have an accuracy higher than 0.4 or something like that. So there's about 170 sires that you can get on the Angus website and see their EPDs for hair shedding. And this is a combination, the data that AGI had available was both from our USDA-funded Mizzou-led project, and then also data collected by Mississippi State and North Carolina State. So why hair shedding, right? So we talked about none of us would want to wear our winter coat in the summertime, but it also has an effect on the performance of these dams. And so when we look at the hair shedding score of the dam relative to the calf's weaning weight, those cows that shed earlier tend to wean a heavier calf. If we use unadjusted weight, so we don't adjust for age, the effect of this relationship between hair shedding and calf weaning weight is larger, telling me that not only are these cows weaning a heavier calf, but they are also weaning a heavier calf, meaning that they're likely getting bred earlier in the breeding season. Hair shedding is a moderately heritable trait. We tend to see heritabilities between 0.32 and 0.4. So this is in line with previous estimates, and it's something that is pretty consistent across data sets that we look at. So whether we're looking at the AGI data, the entire 13,000 animals in the Mizzou data set, the Angus animals, Rangus animals, Hereford animals, IGS breeds, etc., we see very similar heritabilities. One of the other things that was interesting to me is that the repeatability of this trait, so how consistent it is across the multiple records for these cows, is not that much higher than the heritability. In terms of genetic prediction, this can actually be helpful. So this is just an example of various repeatability values. So we have 0.2 there in red, 0.4, which would be similar to the repeatability that we see for hair shedding, 0.5 in green, etc. If we have a very high repeatability, additional records after the first record really have diminishing returns. They don't give us a big boost in the accuracy of our genetic predictions. But as our repeatability gets lower and lower, each additional record gives us more information on that genetics of the animal. So having this repeatability of about 0.4, 0.45 for hair shedding tells us that each additional record, so that animal's record as a 2-year-old, that animal's record as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, etc., helps us have a clearer picture of her genetic potential for hair shedding. When we look at dicing this large data set into different subsets, we can look at the actual prediction accuracy of the EPDs and EPDs that we get out of a basic blood model. And so how we did that is we would take the data set, divide it into its breed groups, and then within each of those breed groups, we would divide it into 10 different subsets. We would then leave 1/10 of the data out of the prediction and compare the genetic predictions from that partial data set to the genetic predictions from the whole data set. And that allows us to get a pretty good picture of the prediction accuracy. And you see that the prediction accuracy ranges from about 0.5 to 0.66. So pretty good prediction accuracies for this trait, which is a good message. So we tend to see, regardless of the trait, if we have enough data, that prediction accuracy tends to hover around 0.6, whether we're talking about marbling, weaning weight, etc. Same is true here with hair shedding. So when we're measuring dispersion here, what we're looking at is what we want to see is for a 1-point increase in the EPD, we see a 1-point increase in the performance of the progeny. So if we saw a 1-pound increase in the weaning weight EPD, we would want to see a 1-pound increase in the weaning weight of the progeny. And that's exactly what we see in these data sets. You can look at that mean column there all of those values are very close to 1, meaning that we don't have any over dispersion in these genetic predictions. They're reliably telling us that the prediction is giving us what the progeny performance will be. Now, one of the things that we pulled out of this model is we took the EPDs for these 13,000 animals, and we grouped them according to breed, and we could plot them. And so what you'll see is that the Brangus animals that have Indocene ancestry, they're going to have some of the lowest hair shedding scores on average per breed. Some of the breeds that have been selected for performance in the show ring, Maine Jew, Shorthorn, they're going to tend to be a little bit later shedding. But one of the things that you see is within each of these breeds, we have a lot of variability, and the bell curves for each of these breeds overlap. So it's not like this one breed is the silver bullet to fix our hair shedding. Within each of the breeds, we have some animals that are breed improvers, and we have some animals that are going to be problems relative to shedding. Okay, wanted to give you a little bit of a taste for some of the biology and the gene effects that we've seen in this data set. So one of the questions in basic biology when we're talking about wild animals or domesticated animals, is it temperature or hours of daylight that is really driving this change in hair shedding from the winter coat to the summer coat? And so we looked at various different models where we included the effects of day length, or we included the effects of temperature. And the problem here is temperature and day length are correlated to one another. So it's really difficult to disentangle these two effects. But what it seems to be is that they, at least when we model them from this statistical perspective, is they both have an influence on the hair shedding of the animal. Now, we took this a step further. So a GWAS, which those who have been coming to BIF meetings and perhaps heard my predecessor, Jerry Taylor, talk about, you've probably heard this acronym before. And when we do a GWAS, we're basically looking for associations, relationships between a DNA marker and variation in the trait. What we did here is what we call a genotype by environment GWAS. And so now what we're looking at is the interaction of the DNA variants and the environment with the trait. So we're looking at that interaction effect. And so if we look at the interaction between temperature and genotype, and if we look at the interaction between day length and genotype, for that interaction between temperature and genotype, we basically see no significant effects. So in terms of identifying loci that allow the animal to perceive the temperature and initiate hair shedding, we don't find any significant effects. However, we find many significant effects that look at this interaction between the animal sensing the environment in terms of the day length and their genotype. Okay? So what this tells us is it's probably more the day length that's really driving the biology of initiating this hair shedding. We can look at other effects that may be important. Some of the interesting ones is fall calving and whether or not an animal is raising toxic fescue. Those results don't stay consistent if we fit temperature in the model. So some of those effects may be temperature specific. However, the age of the animal tends to be pretty consistent regardless of what other environmental effects we try to account for in the model. This is another way to look at those age effects, and really, for those of you who have thought about or looked at hair shedding, those younger animals are going to have a much harder time getting that hair shed off. And that kind of continues until we get to the oldest of the mature cows. And then when we get to kind of older cows that may be, candidates for being culled, some of them tend to have a little bit higher scores, but then the really old cows tend to have lower scores, possibly because if you're going to be a cow that stays in the herd past 14 years of age, you've done a good job getting rid of your hair and don't have that as an issue that can lead to failure. One of the things that it really makes me think about when we look at those younger cows is the hair shedding reflecting or telling us something about the plane of nutrition of these animals. And so one of the things that in retrospect I wish we would have done in this project is record a body condition score for any cows that we're going to collect the hair shedding score on. And so as breed associations, other genetic service providers collect this information, I would suggest and encourage collecting a body condition score. One of the things that we also tried is seeing if the contemporary groups kind of took care of all of this environmental information, or if there was a benefit to adding in day length, temperature, etc. And what we found is if our contemporary groups are well defined, there's no added benefit in accounting for day length, temperature, etc. So basically have large, well-defined contemporary groups, and that's going to take into account these differences in day length. So like we hinted at the beginning of my talk, is cow efficiency and adaptability is a really complex process. And Mike McNeil gave a talk about this back in 2015, among others. But I wanted to go back to this picture. And in this picture, there's two cows standing in the pond trying to cool off. And there's two other cows in the background actually doing the work of being a productive cow, right? So those cows in the background, they're harvesting that forage, which is capturing CO2 and putting it into energy via solar energy. And they're taking that forage and turning it into beef for producers. So two of these cows are doing work, two of these cows are trying to deal with the heat and humidity. And so we need to do a better job of identifying this. Hair shedding is going to influence maternal growth, also known as milk, reproduction, and I would argue possibly even animal welfare, right? If we have animals who shed off, they're going to have an easier job dealing with the heat stress. They're going to be a better state of mind, a better, less state of stress, and so that's better for their welfare. So it's important for us to get a handle on hair shedding in terms of sustainability, in terms of profitability, environmental stewardship, and social responsibility. It's a really easy to measure trait. Anybody can learn to do it, and it's also, in terms of our experience, an easy to predict trait that easily gives us accurate predictions. Now, we haven't investigated using like a threshold model or something like that, but I think as long as the hair shedding scores are collected in a time of the year where we have that nice variation, it wouldn't be problematic. So I'd like to acknowledge all of the collaborators in terms of the breed associations, USDA funding, Bob Schnabel, who is an associate professor at Mizzou, who's a great collaborator of mine, and the various graduate students who worked and postdocs who worked on this local adaptation project. We have several new projects coming down the line. We're looking at Bergman's rule. So that's looking at surface area to volume ratio and how that interacts with genotype by environment and genotype by nutrition or genotype by management interactions. We also have a new grant looking at heifer puberty and fertility, and we're doing some things with gas flux data to look at basal metabolic rate. And so with that, I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions.
Yeah, questions? Joe.
Jared, thank you for your presentation. Just one question on the age of cow. Obviously, that's censored data. So how did you deal with that?
Yeah, we didn't actually account for that being censored data. So we simply, threw that effect into the model and see what the effect is.
So do you think there's a possibility that cows that, at least in certain environments, let's say in fescue, that aren't shedding well and stuff, are dropping out and therefore won't appear as older cows?
That's a good question. So just to repeat for the Zoom audience, I don't know if the Zoom audio is working, but what Joe asked about is in certain environments, if a cow isn't shedding off, is she getting cold? And is that leading to kind of those more mature cows having the lower hair shedding scores? In some operations that actually look at and think about hair shedding, they're probably doing that. But my guess would be that the average producer isn't thinking about hair shedding. Like until we had this project, I think a lot of them weren't. It wasn't on their radar in terms of a selection or calling criteria. So I still think it's worthwhile to try to get a handle on that nutrition plane to better understand the hair shedding. And I think because the hair shedding repeatability is so low, I think hair shedding is also telling us something about what that cow is experiencing in that given year. So I think it also has opportunity as a management tool in the same way we would use body condition score as a management tool. But very good point about the censored data. I definitely think that's what's happening on those very oldest set of cows.
Can I follow up to that?
Yeah.
Because I think Joe brings up a good question. So it's clearly censored data, but if you think that most of the producers are culling opens, the ones that breed every year seem to be the ones that are better shedders.
Yeah.
So back to your question, is it nutrition or is it reproduction that the hair shedding, what's the relationship?
Yeah.
Can you speculate on that? Because
Yeah.
they have to have produced a calf every year, and your data would say that they're better shedders. Yeah, I don't know. Just
especially in spring calving herds.
especially in spring calving herds. Yeah.
That's where the pressure would be greatest.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the things that in our conversations with American Semitole Association, one of the questions they have is how does hair shedding relate to stayability? And I think that's still an open question. Obviously, if there was a relationship there, that would be something that would be useful in terms of either better describing differences in stayability or identifying those cows who have the right tools to be reproductively efficient in challenging heat-stressed environments. So, yeah, another good point that those cows may be failing and being removed.
Jerry, you mentioned that the younger cows have a little more difficult shedding. I believe what we find is that the younger cows that do not shed are the ones that have more problems with body condition. So I think there is an interaction there that the ones that do not shed, particularly young cows, and then I think what Mark said is certainly correct. I believe we lose more of those, particularly if we have a short breeding season, we'll lose those young cows that do not shed because they're low body condition.
Yep. Yeah, so as Gordon Jones points out, in their herd at Red Hills, Red Angus, they've seen this relationship between body condition score and hair shedding. And we actually had an undergrad who was supposed to analyze your data and look at that relationship between body condition score and hair shedding, and she didn't make any progress. So don't have that answer yet. We have collected a small amount of data specifically looking at that body condition score and hair shedding.
Please.
Jared, you get big populations there. Any indication you find slick genes in those populations?
So I think that goes back to that very first slide where I was talking about hair coat versus hair shedding. Here we've really just talked about hair shedding. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention is we get a huge, when we do the GWAS just for hair shedding, we see a huge peak on chromosome 5. And there appears to be probably 3 different causal mutations on chromosome 5 that are very close, that are relatively close together, from like 14 megabase pairs to 24 megabase pairs. No, prolactin, I believe, is on chromosome 23, and that's kind of our next largest hit, is near prolactin. Now, the strongest associations are within a different gene that's kind of the neighbor to prolactin, but we do identify an association very close to prolactin. So I don't think it's to the same extent like there was this mutation in prolactin receptor, or I think it's prolactin receptor, that caused these really shaggy coat dairy cows and that produced no milk. I don't think we found something that's to that same extent, but I think because we're measuring hair shedding in kind of a quantitative way, we're looking at it in terms of typical complex trait where we see lots of small effects spread throughout the genome, but we do pick up this association that's probably regulating the abundance of prolactin, not necessarily a protein change not a change in the sequence of prolactin.
You'd suspect if it was there, they would have found it because they would have shed out. They'd all be scored 1 and it would have some impact on your data, right? But if they were there, they weren't very many, right?
Yeah. And you know, if it was a lot, so basically, the way I like to think about this question is thinking about double-muscled cattle that have the myostatin mutation. That's a huge effect, right? And we could visually tell that difference versus within a data set of Hereford animals that just have different sized ribeyes, right? So in the Hereford data set, we'd see those complex, small effects spread throughout the genome. So that's kind of how we think about this. Is I don't think we see anything strong enough pointing towards a SLIC type mutation. It's more the complex quantitative measure of it.
All right, well,
Thank you guys.
thanks,
Great
Derek.
questions.
Thanks